Commodore fans, are you ready? It's time for another episode of the Vandy247 podcast on the 440 Sports Network. Keep it locked right here for the best Vanderbilt coverage. Whether it's Clark Lee on the gridiron, Mark Byington and Shea Ralph on the hardwood, or Tim Corbin on the diamond, the Vandy247 crew has you covered. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Also, like this video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. That's free and easy to do. Follow the crew on Twitter, Apple Podcast, and Spotify for podcast episodes. Lastly, if you're interested in sponsoring the show, email Chris Lee at chrislee70@gmail.com. And now, pull up a chair. It's time for another episode of the Vandy247 podcast.
Welcome back to Vandy247 Live. I'm your host, Billy Derrick, here on a Monday in Nashville. We're talking a lot of baseball today with the 2025 Vanderbilt baseball season getting underway this weekend. So all of a sudden, baseball is here. So got to talk some VandyBoys. We got Joe Healy from D1Baseball.com hopping on to join us. I do want to mention we'll be talking a lot more basketball ahead of the Auburn game tomorrow, but we'll also have some written content up from Joey Dwyer, of course, as well. We'll touch on it a little bit after the interview with Joe Healy. If you want to fire away your comments and questions, you can certainly do that. Before we do that, though, I want to get to our sponsor read here for basketball season. If you're dreading laundry day, if it's stealing time to do the things that you truly enjoy, let the laundry professionals at the Wash House take care of that for you. They've got 2 great locations in Nashville. Just drop off your dirty laundry, and their professional attendants can give you back the one thing you can never have enough of, your time. Within 24 hours, you can pick up your nicely folded, fresh, and clean laundry, ready to be put away. Log on to washhouseclean.com, stop in today, and get your time back. Again, we're going to talk some baseball here with Joe Healy. If you guys have comments and questions, feel free to fire away. And we'll see if Joe can get him answered. But we've got Joe with us now. Joe, how's everything going?
Good, man. Can't believe this is game week for college baseball. That seems not correct, but here we are. And in typical college baseball fashion, I don't know what it's been like in Nashville, Billy, but here in Raleigh, I live in Raleigh, and we had like beautiful 70-degree days last week. Sunshine, just couldn't have been any better. And like tomorrow's high is 39 or something. So yeah, that's how you know college baseball is here. Is the weather when it's at its worst? College baseball is here.
That always happens. Always happens. Yeah. And yeah, it was 60, 70s a lot of the last week and a half or so, and then this week, luckily Vanderbilt will be in Phoenix playing at the MLB. That does help. They'll be playing at the Desert Invitational there a few games. I want to touch on that a little bit later, but every year I like to ask the question of, okay, with the offseason moves, because now in college baseball, that's what you're talking about heading into seasons. Okay, how is the portal haul? And there's probably a freshman or two that make impacts, Joe. But I just want to start with what they did this offseason, whether it's bringing in Jason King from Dayton, Blankmeyer from Duke, those assistants, but also bringing in some portal guys. It wasn't a massive haul, but more than they had in the past. So what impressions have you had from just this offseason itself from what Tim Corbin has done?
Yeah, in the big picture, whether we're talking the coaching staff changes, the portal additions, what have you, I think the thing that would make me most optimistic if I'm a Vandy fan is that all of that was, I think, an acknowledgement that the current standard was not good enough, that they knew they needed to do something, right? They needed to shake it up. And I think that was a worry among folks, you'd know better than I, but among folks locally was that, well, this formula has worked so well forever and ever, so let's just keep trucking forward and we'll figure it out. And in today's college baseball, I just don't know if that was the case, right? So the fact that they were willing to switch it up, I think is a big deal. On the specifics of it, one thing I like about the Blankmeyer and Jason King hires, a couple different things. One is that Ty Blankmeyer is thought the consensus on him in the coaching industry is that he's a future superstar. Like he's going to be a head coach sooner rather than later. I saw him speak at ABCA, which is the coaches convention right after New Year's. And the dude just commands the stage in a way that a lot of coaches don't, even successful coaches. Like a lot of coaches are uncomfortable in that situation. He was not. That guy commanded the room. The charisma is there. He obviously comes from, a baseball coaching family. Ed Blankmeyer, his father, a longtime St. John's coach. So you like that. And then Jason King, I think what's interesting about that is I'm not saying necessarily that the previous coaches were overly deferential to Tim Corbin. I don't know that. I'm not in the dugout. I'm not in the locker room. But Jason King's been a head coach for a long time and has won, even if some of it was at lower levels of college baseball. So he's not going to be afraid to just be honest and be blunt and just say what he thinks. And I think that's valuable when you have a longtime head coach who's had a lot of success like Tim Corbin, having assistants that are willing to say, when, hey, I don't think this is working, or I think we should do this differently. Because for a lot of coaches, especially young coaches, it's easy to just defer to the legend, right? On the player side, I think similarly, I like that. Look, I mean, a lot of like Cody Bowker's that's a Vanderbilt transfer, right? He's a Georgetown guy, so obviously the academics are in place. He's familiar with the private school situation, like cost of attendance, all that stuff. And good pitcher. But then you look at Mike Mancini, and I know he didn't work out. Like he ended up going back to Winthrop, but Kobe Kropf was not a Vanderbilt type transfer. Not a long track record of success, one big year, public school, all that stuff. Now, again, it didn't work out, but again, I like that it was just outside the box. So I think with Bowker, you have a high floor pitcher. He kind of strikes me as a Sunday guy / Tuesday guy, perhaps. I know Corbs tends to like to put a younger guy on Tuesday, but I think that's a solid addition. And then Mike Mancini, I think, is a little bit, while I don't love that it's yet another second baseman on a team that has a lot of second basemen. What I do like about him is that he's unabashedly an offense-minded infielder. Like that guy wants to hit. And he's improving defensively. He's a pretty good athlete. But he's he's an offensive minded guy. And I think that's obviously, I'm sure we'll talk about this. That's obviously where, the focus is going to be moving forward for Vanderbilt. And did you know, Billy, this might've come up when he got recruited and when he came in as a transfer, that Mike Mancini was the kid in that famous video that you see of, have you ever seen the video where it's a pitcher wearing like an old school Astros hat in like a little league game, and he looks at the catcher and he smirks and nods?
Oh yes, I remember that. Yeah, and
then gets taken like dead center field. That's Mike Mancini. He was the pitcher there, so kind of a funny deal there. But
that was floating around Twitter, I think.
Yeah, but my biggest thought is just, look, I mean, whether or not it all works, we'll see. But I do like, from a Vanderbilt standpoint, that they were willing to say, like, we got to do something different. And they did. So the willingness to change in year, whatever this is of Corbs, but is impressive to me, because a lot of folks don't necessarily do that as easily.
Well, I want to expand on that, and I do want to get into some of the personnel, because after last season, there was a lot of talk of moves have to be made, but what are those moves going to be? Is that going to be just an exodus of players and then bringing in a lot more new players, or is that going to be what are these there's going to be changes, but what are they going to be? And obviously you saw that it was Jason King and Blankmeyer, and then obviously bringing a couple of portal bats in, but Birdie Johnson being a freshman as well. What do you think that says about where Corbin is at with the program now? And he's always said himself that everything is earned, right? He himself has I think he basically said after a game 5-6 years ago, said, I should be fired after this game. Like he's hard on himself as well, as you would expect. What do you think that says about him and his eagerness? And he's a young, however old he is, right? Tim Corbin, I feel like, could coach until he's 80. But what do you think that says about him and where he is with this program? That, okay, what what you said, what we were doing wasn't working. Let's switch things up and see if we can turn this thing into a different direction.
Yeah, a young 63. I just looked it up. 63 years old, Tim Corbin. But you're right, and it's why people. I don't know about you, Billy, but I get asked all the time, like, when is Corbs gonna hang it up? Like, what is his next act? Like, every time a big job comes open, it's like, would he be interested in Texas or something like that? And I'm like, I don't know, man. Like, he just seems like first of all, a lifer that's going to be in this game a long time, and second of all, like, he, I think he just kind of likes where he's at and what he's doing. And anyway, that's a tangent, but. I think it shows like a little bit of what I think people who have been around the program or have covered the program know and have seen firsthand, which is that for all of the soft spokenness that Tim Corbin has, for all of the philosophizing, like I refer to him as, I have archetypes of coaches I think about, and he's what I refer to as a philosopher king kind of coach, which is just like very like coaching the whole person, that kind of that ethos.
Mm-hmm.
But in spite of that, he takes losing as hard as any coach I've ever covered. Like, and it doesn't come out in the same ways, right? But like there are moments you see after a loss when you're waiting, post-game media availability, what have you, where he's just taking it tough. So I think this is an extension of that, where he's like, look, I mean, we're still getting to regionals. We're still hosting regionals. We did that a couple of years ago. So like the thing is not totally broken, but this is not the standard we've set. And so I think it just shows that this guy still wants to be the best. He's still motivated to be the best. And he's not willing to just coast in and say, let me just do, 6 or 7 more years of this, and then I'll step aside and we'll move on. And, and then we'll be done here. Like he wants his next act to be as good as the previous one. And a lot of coaches, I'll use an example from basketball because, it's been on my mind, but like, he's not doing the John Calipari thing where he's going to Arkansas and it's just like, let me just run it back and do the same thing I did at Kentucky and see if it works better. And the answer at least here is no. So, Corbin's just wired differently in that, where he's like, all right, we're going to look at everything we do and we're going to shake it up like a snow globe. And then we're going to see what happens. And the parts of what's been working though are still in place, right? They're still recruiting really talented players. Like the freshmen coming in are still guys that you think have really, really bright futures. There are still a lot of blue chip recruits in this roster. So that part hasn't changed. It's just kind of stuff on the periphery that they're trying to shake up. And I think that's a good thing.
All right, I want to start with the good with this player profile here, and a lot of this is offensively, but defense still matters, of course, at Vanderbilt. But in the SEC, the bats are what is most important. I mean, you look at it. Barzy is a guy that I think there's some high expectations for as the catcher. Braden Holcomb, wherever he files into the scheme defensively. You mentioned Mancini, banged up right now, but we'll see when he gets back. Brody Johnston, Jonathan Vastine, RJ Austin, Maldonado even. So all of a sudden, Joe, you're looking at their core and you like it, right? Last year, some of the best players were not, or some of the leaders of the team may not have been the most talented players, but when your best players are leaders on the team, you're at an advantage. And I think that's kind of where they're at this year. Let's start offensively, the good in your mind. What are you encouraged by coming into this season with this Vanderbilt team?
I think in terms of raw physicality, there's a lot more of that. Last year we saw some of us saw when you're out in the fall and in preseason practice that, hey, this Braden Holcomb kid has a lot of raw juice, but it wasn't certain that he was going to play a ton. And early on in the season, he didn't necessarily. And same thing for Colin Barzy. And so those guys as second year players that have gone through some of the lumps, I think is helpful. And I think, even a guy like Jonathan Vastine, I think, look, if you're a guy who's kind of been considered a defense first shortstop, he's a field general, all that stuff. If that's a guy who's can hit 10 or 12 home runs for a lot of teams, you'll take that for a guy you think of as a glove first shortstop. So I do think there is an opportunity for this team to be a little more physical. I mean, Brody Johnston also part of that. And I will pause here to say one thing I've been thinking about a lot with Brody Johnston is I'm not sure his situation is very one of one to me, where I'm sure it's happened in the history of college baseball. I'm just not aware of it. But the idea that he was a good, but not necessarily heralded prospect coming out of high school. And then he goes to play summer ball before his freshman year, which is already something a lot of freshmen don't do, incoming freshmen. And then all of a sudden, like 5 minutes into being in summer ball, we're like, holy cow, who is this guy? And then he gets on campus in the fall and he just keeps hitting. And now we're at a place where any list of SEC Freshman of the Year candidates has to have him on it. And I do worry a little bit about maybe putting a little too much expectation on him, but it's not like this isn't smoke and mirrors, right? Like I've seen freshmen have big fall practice periods and then it ends up not really translating. But the idea that he was in over the summer with a lot of 21, 22-year-old arms using a wood bat and is hitting home runs at 110 miles an hour. Like you can't fake that. You can't fake those exit velos. You can't fake that hard contact. And so I think that translates. So while it is kind of a crazy story, like the reality is like this dude is good and has proven himself and is kind of, I don't want to say come out of nowhere, because he was a good prospect. He was not a, a baseball equivalent of a 2-star guy. Like he was well thought of, but he wasn't what Ethan McIlvain was at this time last year in terms of hype.
Yeah.
Right. So anyway, I think there's the potential to be more physical. The problem is in this version of the SEC, the standard of physicality is so high. Like you go look at the team leaderboards for home runs and it's just SEC, 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 SEC. So can they get to middle of the pack in terms of physicality? Like if they can do that, I think they're onto something here, because I don't want to boil it down to just one thing necessarily, but in this version of the SEC, you've got to be able to win 12 to 10 games. And with the lineup they've had the last couple of years, that's just not something I have a lot of faith they can do. This year, I think there's opportunity for them to do a little more of that, and we'll see.
Is Brody Johnson a guy that could be a Gavin Grahovec type, like this year, like one of those just explosive SEC freshmen, you think, in your mind?
Yeah, I think so. I think he fits a lot of the hallmarks of that. Like it's again, like the data you can't fake, like exit velos, things like that. He's also a competent defender. Like that's a thing especially at Vanderbilt. Like if you do not play defense, you will not play. And the fact that he, at third base, at least where I saw him in the summer, like he's got quick hands. He moves pretty well laterally. He's not a burner. Like his range isn't going to be great, but it's third base. You're not really looking for range there. He's got a strong arm. So that'll help keep him on the field, even if he hits like a little bit of a freshman wall. But I think that's absolutely in play to be a Grahovec type player, because if you look at Gavin Grahovec's numbers, obviously they're really impressive, but that's still a dude that struck out like 90 times last year at Texas A&M. So you can be a incomplete player and still have a big impact like Grahovec had last year. So that's a high standard, but man, after I saw him in the summer and heard a lot of good things again in the fall, like I think I'm just kind of done being somewhat skeptical of his ability to do this right away. And this program is not one that's in the business of just throwing freshmen out there that they don't think are ready. Like a lot of folks last year, and myself included, I'll just point the finger at myself. We're like, look, this team needs offensive firepower. Why isn't Braden Holcomb playing every day from the jump? And we saw some of the holes in his swing and some of the holes in his game. And then you realize, oh, okay, like I kind of get it now. So the fact that there seems to be no hesitation to go ahead and put him in big spots, I think speaks to the readiness that the staff feels he has, which is obviously worth a heck of a lot more than folks like you and I suggesting that he's ready.
Right. Let's get into the bad, what you're concerned with this team. I have a feeling you might go pitching, which is ironic, with Vanderbilt. Maybe you don't, but I have heard some concerns, talking to people that this may not be the deepest bullpen that Vanderbilt's ever had. And even the rotation, right? How does that sort out? You've got dudes there, but who becomes the starter on the weekend, who becomes that Tuesday night guy, like you said, and who just kind of filters into the bullpen. It'll be interesting to see how this pitching staff, filters out. But in your mind, Joe, what worries you the most with this Vanderbilt team?
I think it's less about, and I'll do a little bit of a dive on the pitching because I have thoughts there too, but I think it's less about a specific unit that worries me for Vanderbilt. I wonder if this is just going to be a team where when you stack up 1 through 16 in the league, offensively, pitching wise, that they're just going to kind of be in the middle in both. And if you're not going to be great offensively, you better be Arkansas in terms of pitching talent, right? Like Arkansas, I think, has the best rotation in the country. Like, because I don't like Arkansas's offense that much either, right? But their pitching is so good that it's like, okay, well, they might just win a bunch of 5-3 games and that might be okay. So that's more my concern. I understand where people are coming from with concerns about the pitching, though. Like I'm not blind to that. When you're looking at, okay, I think we have a pretty good amount of confidence in JD Thompson. At least I do. Like I think he showed really well last year. I think he might be the next man up in terms of being a workhorse. But then you're looking at, an Ethan McIlvain who was banged up last year. You're looking at Cody Bowker, who he talked about, who I think he's a high floor guy, but I don't really know how high his ceiling is. The stuff is good, not great. The bullpen guys just look different too. I mean, they really, guys like Cyber and Miller Green saved the team's bacon last year. I mean, that bullpen were actually a lot better, I think, than some had hoped, but it just looks different, right? There's no those guys aren't fireballers. They have good stuff, in Miller Green in particular. I mean, it's a Team USA guy, but they're not back there throwing 100 miles an hour, So just if you're used to this kind of high octane Vanderbilt pitching staff, this isn't necessarily that. Doesn't mean it's better or worse. I think pitchability actually plays a little bit more in especially the SEC right now, because velocity is a little bit of a dime a dozen, I feel like, in the league. You still need velocity, but so pitchability I think plays a little bit, because you just don't see that as much pitchability, I feel like. So in the big picture, I think my bigger worry is less about one area of the game being subpar, and more just that I think they might just be average across the board, or slightly above average, which above average in the SEC is like good for what, 7th or 8th in the league, right? So that feels like kind of, and we have them ranked as such, right? 16. That's kind of like on the fringe of the upper tier, but but also not that far away from being in like the fringe of the bubble conversation again, right? The 10th, 11th place team in the SEC. So that's more of my concern, is that they just might not be excellent at any one thing, and maybe that'll be okay, but we'll have to see.
All right, I got 2 more quick ones here. I want to touch on the SEC as a whole after this, but obviously Vanderbilt opens in Phoenix. They go Friday, Saturday, Sunday. They'll play at Grand Canyon, then they'll play Nebraska and UC Irvine. Those 3 teams, give us a little cliff notes on those teams and who to watch for, maybe what Vandy fans could expect from the Commodores this weekend, and how tough it might be.
Tough. All 3 good teams. We have Nebraska ranked. We talked about Irvine being ranked. If we ranked to 30, I think Irvine's probably there. And Grand Canyon at this point, I think is the most consistent team in their conference. The other thing about the Grand Canyon game is that is a road game. The other 2 are neutral sites, but the Grand Canyon game is on campus. And so there's 2 things about that. One is that unless they've changed something, and I don't say this to poke fun at Grand Canyon necessarily, but the lighting there used to be poor. As of last season, the lighting was not great at night games. So that can be something if you're used to playing in really nice SEC venues, right? Or minor league parks where like the lighting is pristine and you don't have any issues. Like if you're watching the broadcast, you will notice that it's dark. Again, unless they've changed something that I'm not aware of. I don't cover Grand Canyon all that closely, so I can't say. But very talented team. They're not going to, especially with whoever their Friday guy is, they're not going to look out of place against Vanderbilt. The depth isn't as good, obviously. We'll see how that plays out. Nebraska is going to be tricky. Now, I think they'll miss, I assume they will miss Mason McConaughey, who is Nebraska's best guy. He's a very real prospect. He's somebody who I think is going to be in that Big Ten Pitcher of the Year race. But I also really like Nebraska's bullpen. So that's one, if their starter gets 4 or 5 innings, I think Nebraska is going to do the thing where you just see arm after arm after arm. So it could be a little bit of a lengthy game, but I do like some of the depth they have there. And then Irvine, you're going to have to be ready to swing. Irvine throws a lot of strikes. That's typical, like Big West baseball, Fullerton, Irvine, Santa Barbara, just a lot of strikes. They're not going to be overly physical, although they are more now than they have been in the past. Not going to be overly physical. Their pitchers aren't really going to blow anything by you, but a ton of strikes. You're going to have to be ready to swing the bat. And depending on how the ballpark plays on that day, I mean, you're playing, in a minor league park or a spring training park. And so those can sometimes play a little bit big. I think, Tennessee found that out last year before. They lost one of their opening weekend games in Phoenix, and it was a lot of flyouts 385 feet away. That can happen. And so you have to, that's maybe a game in which the fact that Vanderbilt isn't home run reliant, that might actually play into their hand a little bit. But so this is not going to be a weekend where Vanderbilt can just waltz in there and kind of think they're going to out talent people. I don't think they'll expect that. But if you're a Vandy fan thinking, yeah, we'll have the advantage in all 3 of these games, maybe. But if you don't play well, you're not going to win. These are 3 teams that very much in the regional race. So yeah, no soft competition this weekend for sure.
Looking forward to it. The Friday game will be on MLB Network at 7, and then Saturday night at 7 o'clock on MLB Network as well. So looking forward to that. Lastly here, Joe, the SEC as a whole, decent conference. I mean, it's okay.
They're doing all right.
I mean, like basketball, I'm hearing that, this could be the best baseball has been in a long time. I feel like we say that every year. But how are you looking at the pecking order? And I guess to form this question into it, where does Vanderbilt stand in that pecking order? Now that like they could be the 7th or 8th team, but that might be good for 2nd or 3rd in any other conference. So where how do you look at the SEC as a whole, and then where does Vandy stand?
Yeah, I think the strength of it is undeniable. What'll be interesting though, and my colleague Mark Etheridge wrote about this for a piece that's going up this week on the side of just, okay, we saw in football that it seemed like some folks caught up to the SEC in some ways. Do we see that in baseball? I will let you listeners read for yourself to find out what Mark thinks. But I think right now it is undeniable that they're just kind of head and shoulders above. And you see that in the rankings where, I don't know the exact numbers on it, but I know it's like 4 of the first 5 and then 6 or 7 of the top 10. That's just kind of the reality of it. And so with Vanderbilt, as I alluded to earlier, where we have them ranked, they are either at the very back end of the upper tier or they're kind of at the start of the middle tier. And that feels apropos, not just of this team, but of Vanderbilt writ large the last 3 seasons, where sometimes they can kind of masquerade as, oh, this is Vanderbilt's back. They win the SEC tournament a couple of years ago, and it's like, hey, now this team is ready to make some noise in the postseason, and then they just kind of, fizzled in a regional, right? So that there are times where they flash what they used to be or what they could be, and there are times where they look pretty pedestrian, not just by their own standard, but by the SEC standard. And so the ranking of 16 feels apropos of that, where it's like, yeah, this team could host, and if you're hosting, you are by definition a serious candidate to go to Omaha and play for a national title. On the other hand, if you end up closer to 25, you're a 2 seed going someplace pretty difficult to play, a Clemson again. And, that's going to be a tough place to get out of. And then you're back in this situation that we've been in the last couple of years, which is this really, I don't want to say overwrought because I think it's fair, but this really intense debate about the health of Vanderbilt baseball, which is just a bonkers conversation to be having after, 6 years ago, they put one of the best teams I've ever seen on the field and won a national title. And it was like, well, they have perfected college baseball. And here we are, not that much further down the road, and we're having these conversations, which again, I think are fair, but just kind of, it's bizarre that if you'd have told me 6 years ago we'd be having them, I couldn't have imagined what would have do that. And yet here we are. And I think it has less to do with Vanderbilt and more to do with just the rest of the SEC, frankly. Like the high tide has risen all boats. And I think we're going into a year in the SEC where, take Missouri out of it, I think the other 15 are all thinking they could be postseason teams. And the ones who aren't are going to be really upset about it, right? Like Missouri understands that, like, hey, we know where we're at. But if South Carolina is the next worst team in the SEC, like, they're not going to love that. If it's Ole Miss again, I think we understand what might be the case there. If it's Mississippi State, right? I mean, like, on and on and on. A handful of teams are going to miss the postseason and be pretty pissed about it. And that's where we are in the SEC is just, they're not going to get 15 teams into regionals. The math on that just doesn't work. So who are going to be those teams that get left out, and what kind of existential questions do we have about them? Maybe somebody else will be in this position at this time next year of asking existential questions. But for now, it's Vanderbilt, and we'll have to see how it plays out.
Looking forward to it. It's going to be another awesome season of SEC baseball. Gets going this weekend. Joe, real quick before I let you go, I want you to give people opportunity to subscribe to SEC Extra. Of course, D1 Baseball. I'm sure a lot of Vandy fans are already D1 Baseball subscribers, but may not have heard about SEC Extra. It's pretty cool what you guys do.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, SEC Extra is a little add-on. You could subscribe to it on its own. You don't have to be a general D1 Baseball subscriber. If you're just really into Vanderbilt or just really want to keep up with the SEC, you can go and subscribe to just the SEC Extra package, which we have a little bonus with that now. We also launched ACC Extra, and if you subscribe to one, you get the other for free. So you subscribe to SEC, you get the ACC stuff for free, which, you may or may not be into that, but it's just more content we're giving you. So you can also use code 25season to get 25% off your subscription over at d1baseball.com. Speaking for myself and my colleagues, if you haven't been on board, now's the time to do it, and we'd be humbled and honored if you'd give us a shot.
Joe, appreciate it. Looking forward to the season. Good luck with your coverage, and really appreciate you hopping on.
All right, Billy. Happy to do it. See you, man.
That's Joe Healy from D1Baseball.com. Does a really, really good job covering college baseball, SEC specifically. So, but seriously, if you haven't subscribed to SEC Extra, you're missing out. I mean, that's the best SEC baseball coverage out there. And go subscribe because it is absolutely legit what Mark Etheridge and Joe Healy have been doing. So great baseball talk there. Of course, it all gets underway this weekend in Phoenix. Friday night, Vanderbilt at Grand Canyon, 7 o'clock first pitch on the MLB Network. And then Saturday night against Nebraska in Phoenix as well, 7 o'clock on the MLB Network. And then Sunday afternoon at 1 o'clock against UC Irvine. That all gets going this weekend. I wanted to go ahead and get your appetite going for baseball. I didn't want to do this too late in the week. I wanted to go ahead and get this out of the way so you guys have all week to listen to it with Joe Healy. And we'll talk more baseball throughout this week as well with Vanderbilt traveling out to Phoenix. But we also got to talk more basketball and not spending a ton on it today. If you guys got questions about tomorrow night's Auburn game, feel free to fire away any comments or questions you've got. But big time game, of course, tomorrow. Number 1 Auburn. They're number 1 right now. They'll probably be number 2. They just lost to Florida. Maybe they're number 3. I don't know. But you would guess Alabama's number 1 because of the rankings mechanics. But number 1 Auburn as of right now coming to town, 6 o'clock tip-off on the SEC network. Can they do it? Can they do it again? We'll talk a lot more about it. Joey, I'm going to try to do something with Joey tomorrow, something live preferably. So we'll keep you guys posted on that. We do have another Real Deal podcast coming out tomorrow. We've got Shay Ralph and Jada Brown coming on. So we'll have a women's basketball flavor on the Real Deal podcast tomorrow. But Vandy Auburn tomorrow night, 6 o'clock. Got VandyBoys starting their season up this weekend out in Phoenix. Women's basketball rolling on. Right here is the place to be, Vandy247.com. Subscribe to this YouTube channel. Like this video. Comment. Leave a rating on our Apple Podcast, Spotify feed as well. If you're listening and haven't subscribed to Vandy247.com yet, please do. You're missing out. We got 30% off an annual VIP membership right now on the site. We've got all kinds of stories up right now. Bryce Gilmore just released his top 6 finalists ahead of the spring, and Vanderbilt is one of those top 6. Gilmore's a big-time offensive lineman there. Also, congratulations to Vanderbilt football alumni Oren Burks and Kari Blasingame on winning the Super Bowl with the Eagles last night. That's big time. Oren Burks played a lot in that game. I think Blasingame played a little bit as the fullback, but congrats to those guys, and wanted to get that out there. But subscribe to our YouTube channel, as I mentioned. Also, if you're interested in sponsoring the show, email Chris Lee at chrislee70@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you again soon with more episodes of the Vandy 24/7 podcast.